She called it stewardship when she wanted to feel righteous about it. Stewardship of outcomes. Stewardship of endings. She took charge of small futures the way other people took charge of pets, fed them carefully, groomed them until strangers, admired the shine, and then, when the time came, closed the door and let the room go quiet. The papers would later use the phrase Black Widow because the papers always needed something with teeth. She preferred statistics. Percentages calmed her more than metaphors ever could. Her name in this marriage was Mara Voss, a name chosen because it traveled well from cocktail introductions to legal filings. The house sat in a neighborhood that pretended it remembered how to mean something. Newly planted trees, delivered porches, flags in seasonal rotation. Her husband, Holden Pike, liked to mow in straight lines because order, in his view, was a civic duty. He worked in a building with more glass than sense and wore the kind of watch that could make an airport scanner fall in love. He smiled. For photographs with his chin slightly tucked because somewhere in college a debate coach told him it conveyed humility. Mara collected details. She liked them the way other people liked music. The exact number of steps from the front door to the kitchen island. The way the refrigerator's hum deepened when the freezer decided to matter. Which neighbor waved with their wrist and which with their elbow. Whose dog barked at garbage trucks and whose barked at thunderstorms, and whose barked because barking was what identity felt like inside a skull that knew only one verb. She knew the rhythm of trash day, the hour the mail arrived, the way the upstairs hall held cool air longer than the bedrooms. She measured dyes in fabrics by how the morning light boarded them up. The plan with Holden was not complex. Complexity was a garnish used by amateurs to hide a lack of technique. Clean lines, clinical cause, no drama that could be photographed, an exit that looked like a statistic. She had been careful with the other exits. Life insurance was a tool, not an ambition. She never chased it as a sport. Accidents wore out. Tragedy needed rotation. This time would be something gentler on paper, something their friends would discuss while spooning sympathy into each other's mouths over brunch. She had her timetable. She had her procurement. She had her patience balanced like a coin on a table no one bumped. What she did not have, what she believed no one could have with her, was error. The house learned her movements. She rewarded it with restraint. She rarely moved things without telling 3 other things why. She labeled containers on the pantry shelf with dates in a hand that could have sold stationery. She rotated grocery brands at the same cadence as the local sales cycle, so no cashier would ever feel motivated to remember her preferences. She kept a red notebook inside a white box inside a blue bag behind a row of cookbooks that had never met heat. The notebook contained more verbs than nouns. She did not write plans so much as sequences. The most dangerous people in the world, she knew, were the ones who believed plans survived contact with mornings. She watched Holden watching her. Her husband loved her the way men love things that thing back. Houses, cars, the sudden luck of a partner who wears silence like jewelry. He admired her restraint because he mistaken it for deference. He liked to imagine himself as the more complicated person in the room. She let him. Every marriage needs 2 egos. Only one of them should be fed. The first oddness arrived in the most American way possible, as content. An article scrolled past her morning screen about microdosing cynicism into relationships. A breezy essay with cartoon illustrations. She swiped it away but found herself thinking about smaller measures, about slow work that left fewer fingerprints. She was already a devotee of slow work, but devotion sharpens when challenged by novelty-wearing confidence. She set her timetable. Back a week and watched Holden react to nothing. He made turmeric tea in the evenings for his joints because a podcast told him to. He listened to the podcast during drives to a gym that tried to sell enlightenment between sets. She did not mock him for any of it, because contempt is the appetite that gives itself away too early. She drank the tea he placed beside her book on the coffee table. She complimented the color, the way it carried the sunset into a cup. He smiled the smile people use when they find themselves surprisingly useful at home. The second oddness was smaller and therefore heavier. A spice jar that used to sit with its label facing outward now faced the wall. Not once, but twice in the same week. Not after cleaning, not after guests, not after anything she could name. A tiny misalignment like a comma in a sentence that had already found its breath. She faced the label outward and ejected the thought. The third oddness didn't bother with subtlety. She woke before the alarm with a taste in her mouth she could not name. It was almost metallic, but not the obvious kind. The word that arrived was penny, which made no sense because she had not held coins in months. She brushed long and hard enough to resent the toothbrush. Coffee flattened it, but did not send it away like a good employee. She made a note in the red notebook, taste, uninvited, morning. She did not change anything else because changing too many variables turns investigation into theater. Holden's routine behaved obediently. Gym at 7 when his calendar allowed. A smoothie he called fuel even when it wasn't. Emails on a phone case that might as well have been a passport. He curated his own breakfast with the simplicity of a man who never met an instruction label. He didn't trust. He liked it when she touched his arm as he passed. He liked the idea that rhythm could be romantic. Mara's hands stayed steady, which is how she measured health. She required steadiness for the work she did at the small table in the upstairs office, where a laptop pretended to be a less dangerous machine, and the printer believed in itself enough to resume after paper jams with a sigh. She worked for an entity that used the word advisory frequently and ultimately. Her deliverables wore charts like fig leaves and convinced people twice her age to nod slowly in rooms that smelled like dry erase markers. Her life was a spreadsheet with good posture. The taste returned the next day. She recorded it again in Niti Munia, the notebook with the same economy of description. She added mild fog behind the eyes. Not pain, not dizziness. Just a sense that the world had turned down its saturation while she was asleep. She noticed it most when passing mirrors. Her body looked like a version of itself taken with a camera that didn't know how to tell the truth. It could have been the tea. It could have been the new brand of oatmeal. It could have been the change in water filters that Holden handled because the under-sink cabinet made her wrists itch. She had trained herself to distrust obvious explanations when obviousness arrived under the arm of convenience. She let 2 more days pass. The taste did not improve its manners. Once, at the grocery store, she caught herself standing in front of the pharmacy aisle reading labels about side effects with the intensity of a person searching for a missing dog. She put a bottle back on the shelf without remembering picking it up. She walked out without purchasing anything because nerves deserve small gifts. Holden kissed her cheek before bed with the careful aim of someone who believed affection lived in muscle memory. She counted to 4 after he left the room and opened the red notebook. She wrote 2 words: microdose, pivot. She moved 3 pieces in the house without moving any objects. She moved the tea into a travel mug, she rinsed herself and returned the clean ceramic cup to the cabinet. She started drinking from a glass she kept in the upstairs bathroom. A glass Holden never touched because hydration upstairs looked like an apology to him, and apologies belonged downstairs where guests could witness them. She replaced her vitamin bottle with an identical bottle she had purchased 2 months prior with a different batch lot number because inventory is a language some people never learn to speak, and she waited 3 days more. The taste did not leave. It apprenticed itself to her mornings and demanded tuition. Fog behind the eyes became fog behind the thoughts. Not incompetence, not confusion, just the slight delay of a commuter who keeps missing the first step of the escalator. She watched her body from the outside the way actors watch themselves on monitors between takes. She began to sleep like a person reciting sleep, not performing it. She woke with the feeling that the night had cleaned her and then put the dirt back by mistake. The thing about a slow kill is that it looks like life. Life is additive and subtractive at the same time. You never know which part should be measured. If the enemy is time and the weapon is routine, then survival depends on inventory and on arrogance, but only the right kind of arrogance. The arrogance that assumes the world can be read if you own the right grammar. She did not suspect Holden. She interrogated the house first because houses have no stake in outcomes. She checked the water reservoir in the refrigerator and swapped. It, for one, purchased that day without telling the refrigerator about the swap because appliances perform better when spared burdensome information. She switched the jar of honey used in evening tea to a jar in the back with a label from a different beekeeper. She rotated the spice rack and then rotated it back. She changed nothing that could not plausibly be an accident. She kept eating at the table with Holden. She kept touching his arm. She kept letting him see her with a book open and the lamp on, and the rest of her quiet like good news that knows when it is safe to show up. The body began offering additional footnotes. Her skin learned a new story none of her friends would notice, a dullness under the cheekbones like the shadow of a future she had not purchased. Her heartbeat felt slightly more committed to drama than the average adult heart, a blooming in the ankles by evening that shrank into the night with the discipline of someone who liked rules, but not too many. Mara checked the front door camera feed, something Holden handled because he enjoyed the sense that he had grafted an eyeball onto the house. Nothing entered that bothered her. Routine deliveries. Neighborhood teens performing their regular theater of indirectness under hoodies. A raccoon with an admirable refusal to commit to the laws of trash. She reviewed, Holden across new weeks with fresh eyes. He did not smile more. He did not ask after her more. He introduced small vitamins to his own routine through the week, the kind of supplements that sold hope by the month. He mentioned a new policy at work that would require travel every other quarter. He tossed an apple in the air in the kitchen, something he did when he wanted to perform casual competence. She watched the apple turn and wondered if fruit knew when it was being used as metaphor. The taste in her mouth acquired a newer companion, a faint fatigue that lived not in muscles but in the space between decisions. She could still decide. She simply had to invite willpower to dinner more often. She timed herself on stairs and pretended the game mattered. She noticed her attention for certain details thinning, not to vanishing, but to the point where she had to choose where to aim it. There exists a kind of pride that insists on medical care. She rejected it. Doctors are archivists when you need editors. She preferred to edit. She purchased a private panel through a service that never pronounced its own name out loud and pricked the side of her fingertip with more feeling than she liked. She mailered her blood like correspondence to a stranger she planned to reject if the letter sounded overly intimate. She waited with a patience that felt purchased, not earned. Mara did not share any of this with anyone. The point of her life had always been the economy of other people's knowledge. People do not need to know. People need to be included only when inclusion will make a difference and they can be trusted with difference. Her inventory of trustworthy objects was long. Her inventory of trustworthy humans fit easily on the back of a postcard. The report arrived with the crispness of an export from a well-fed database. Numbers, ranges, boxes filled with shading that smiled or frowned depending on context. A few lines bent out of their lanes enough to warrant a gesture from a professional voice that could be purchased hourly. She took the gesture under advisement and closed the laptop because advice too early rots. The results did not feel like a verdict. They felt like the outline of an accusation that had not yet learned the words it needed to prosecute. She could work with that. Holden brought home tulips that evening because the store near his office kept a refrigerator near the counter full of apologies. He placed them in the vase with the satisfaction of a man who believes color is its own currency. She admired them precisely as he wanted her to admire them. A petal fell with the performative grace of a movie extra. She watched it land against the rim and mark the clock. Small movements, then. She moved the jar of turmeric to a different shelf. She tried drinking the tea with a lid. She used a different kettle. She touched the bags of supplements with the same hand and photographed her fingerprints in the greasy film certain plastics. Attract when bored. She rearranged the knife block by 1 inch to see if Holden noticed that anything could be moved in this house without permission. She watched his eyes as he chopped vegetables and found nothing there except the level concentration of a person who respects sharp edges. Mara began a second notebook. The blue notebook lived in a place no one would find unless they had been instructed to look for it by someone who used to live inside her skin. The blue notebook was not for verbs. It was for names. The names were not of people. They were of objects. The new kettle, the other glass, the extra filter stored upstairs, the older honey, the garage fridge. She divided the house into districts and elected representatives from each, because power, even in a kitchen, prefers organization. When she drank, she timed the taste. The taste came faster when the tea came from the gray mug. The taste came later when the tea came from the travel cup. The taste came not at all when the tea came not at all, but that proved only that liquid obeyed physics, not that malice existed. Quitting everything at once would have been a confession to herself, and she did not grant confessions without counsel. She did not intend to think of Holden as an adversary. It cost a marriage to do that, and she preferred to leave assets in play until the ledger required otherwise. But the adjective no longer behaved. Adversarial thoughts rehearsed themselves in the shower and practiced introductions whenever he leaned against the counter and told her something about traffic that contained the entire world for him. She listened with sincerity, the only type of listening that keeps blood pressure consistent in households where one person holds an unshared hypothesis. She thought about motive, though motive bored her. She thought about his accounts and the small automatic transfer he had set up years ago to go into a fund that promised safety at 70. She noted the timing when he increased the life insurance at his company because a friend at work had insisted everyone do it after a funeral for a colleague who left a mess. She thought about the way he sometimes stood in doorways looking like a man who had recently won an argument with a mirror. Night grew a little heavier. The fog behind the thoughts became a low cloud ceiling, the kind pilots respect and amateur meteorologists treat like a personality flaw. On a Tuesday, she missed a meeting. Holden did not notice because his respect for her work was abstract. He admired what the job did for their tax bracket more than for her. She appreciated that about him. It kept things crisp. She ate strawberries one morning and found one that looked bruised under perfectly fine light. She did not eat that one. She lined it up on the counter and looked at it until even she felt ridiculous. She threw it away and wrote the word strawberry in the blue notebook, then immediately crossed it out because melodrama is just a poorly timed adjective. The idea that she might be under attack arrived gently, like a text message from a number she nearly recognized. Not an assault, not a blazing rebellion, a campaign, long-term, low-temperature, plausibly deniable. The kind of campaign she herself admired in theory, the kind of campaign she had practiced carefully. The realization did not insult her, it aroused her in the sense that attention is a form of desire. To be worth this kind of work meant she mattered. She had always known she mattered. Now the house admitted it. Now her husband admitted it without saying anything at all. She did not confront him because confrontation drains both parties while feeding no one. She watched instead. The undersink area, his domain, came into view more often. He changed the filter more frequently, a responsible habit that made her feel practical gratitude even as she recorded the gesture. He cleaned the kettle with more enthusiasm than anyone should bring to kettles. He offered to make her coffee. He had never offered coffee. Coffee felt like her religion. She declined politely and let him watch her decline. She asked herself how she would do it if she wanted to do it to herself. She drafted 3 archetypes of method and then 3 subtypes for each because 9 seemed like an intelligent number. She combined them with vessels already in the house and with routines he could plausibly own. The kettle was an obvious suspect. The tea was an obvious suspect. The oatmeal was an obvious suspect. Obvious suspects, when manipulated properly, become alibis. Her suspicion grew legs and then learned how to walk quietly. She needed data. Data that did not rely on her body's opinion of itself. She began with a plant. A basil plant in a small pot near the kitchen window had been soldiering along for months. She watered it with water from the upgraded filter and with water from the upstairs bathroom and with water that had passed through the kettle and cooled. She recorded leaf response with the seriousness of a researcher no grant would ever fund. The leaves nearest the stem browned when given cooled kettle water 3 days in a row. She wanted to call that correlation. She called it theater. She bought a second basil plant at a grocery store where the clerk barely cared enough to scan. She gave it the cooled kettle water for a week. The plant did not die. It sulked. She did not include sulk in the notebook. She knew when to let a negative result live without an explanation. She thought about contacting an enemy. The safest people to contact are enemies. Their motives are simple and interest is dependable. But enemies come with receipts. Receipts require context you cannot predict. She resisted the obvious thrill of making a chessboard and ordering pieces. She returned to data. She heated water in the kettle while Holden was upstairs. She poured it into 2 cups, one she rinsed with the filtered water first and one she did not. She tasted both, then threw both away, then wrote nothing because tasting in this case was farce. She considered calling a laboratory and realized that laboratories do not take calls without questions she could not yet form. Holden came downstairs in a shirt he knew made him look like he meant it. He touched her waist as he passed. He smelled like a man who earns his soap. He said something about meetings, and she watched his mouth move while she separated his words from the intention standing behind them. She believed him about the meetings. The intention was the same as it had always been. The day should admire him. The fog behind the eyes brightened once and then dimmed again, the way lights in old buildings do when the power grid argues with the weather. Her heartbeat performed a small solo. She closed her eyes for a count and opened them on the same world. She smiled at Holden, which satisfied his need for a perimeter check. He left at the same minute he always left. Mara stood still in the kitchen until the silence learned to fall into itself. She opened the cupboard with the tea and moved 3 boxes without relocating any. Behind the 3rd box sat a container she did not recall purchasing. It was a brand of herbal blend that advertised sleep in italicized whisper. She did not drink it. She did not throw it away. She did not touch it without 2 layers of decision. She wrote the brand name in the blue notebook and closed the page with the deliberateness of a judge ferried by cameras. The first wave of anger arrived at last, but it did not dress itself in red. It wore a simple suit. It was functional and well-tailored. It tightened her breathing only enough to make speech expensive. She allowed it to stand at the back of the room. She did not seat it. She ate nothing she had not personally opened that day. She drank nothing she had not poured. She watched Holden's hands in the evenings when he performed husbandry over the kitchen sink. His hands did not shake. His hands had never learned that language. He believed in the competence of his own grip, and the world had mostly agreed. The fog settled into her afternoons now with a steadiness that would have been soothing if it had not been rude. She worked through it the way she had worked through colds in other lives, with contempt and hot water and stubbornness purchased wholesale. She wondered if she would meet a threshold soon. The threshold, if it existed, did not announce itself. The body is an apartment building with poor management. Warnings go unanswered until alarms learn to be quiet. She opened the red notebook one night when Holden fell asleep with the television politely entertaining him and wrote a new sequence. It began with the assumption that she had been poisoned. The word sat on the page like a word from a novel. It did not feel like it belonged to her life. She underlined nothing. She added verbs: observe, isolate, reverse. She appended a new verb she had never used for herself: survive. She did not change her plan for Holden. She broadened it. She introduced a line in the timetable for contingency. She listed ways to exit a situation that required exiting in a way that could be narrated without making anyone sound unkind. She placed a single entry at the end of the sequence and circled it. Antidote. Not a specific, not a chemistry, a philosophy. In an earlier life, she had believed that antidotes lived in bottles. In this life, the antidote would live in narrative, which is where most medicine for people like her actually works. By the time the tulips browned, she had learned enough to begin believing the worst. The kettle belonged to him. The undersink belonged to him. The ritual of tea belonged to him because gifts are rituals when repeated enough times. He had microdosed a story into her body the way she had microdosed stories into other rooms. He had read the same content as she had read, perhaps in a different font. He had made small adjustments. He had measured patience in teaspoons. He had poisoned her first. The thought did not land like a revelation. It perched. It watched. It cleaned one wing with its beak and let the other hang like a shrugged coat. She did not collapse under it because collapse is for people who believe their bodies are the final judges. She judged. She wrote. She adjusted the plan. In bed, Holden slept on his side facing away, the way men who prefer control sleep, their backs offered to the world because the world has already been arranged. She lay awake and watched the ceiling explain shadows to the room. She breathed like a woman who would be alive in the morning because wanting it was not enough. She had to be competent at wanting. She thought about all the times she had been told that love was a war no one could win. She thought about how wars end not with victory, but with a new map. The map changed while she watched it. The new map did not scare her. It reminded her how she had arrived here, not by trusting luck, not by collecting enemies for sport, not by believing she could write a story without writing it. She had arrived here by inventory, by stewardship, by refusing to let endings choose themselves. Morning brought the taste again. She smiled at it because enemies deserve acknowledgement or they become petty. She brushed her teeth twice and used the travel cup and took the stairs at speed to remind her heart of its obligations. Holden kissed the top of her head and left for a breakfast with someone who managed budgets with a personality attached. She waved from the window because habits protect you until they don't, and then you must choose which to keep for their style. She waited until the car's taillights vanished, and then she moved. The kettle went into a box. The undersink water system went into a contractor's docket with a service call scheduled for 3 p.m. by a voice that had no idea what it had saved. The tea went into a bag destined for the trunk of her car and then to a donation bin, supervised by a retiree who believed kindness was a martial art. The glass downstairs became Holden's. The glass upstairs became the only one she would use. The pantry shelves acquired labels in a language Holden never learned. She called a number she reserved for events she had not previously experienced. The voice on the other end recognized her default name and offered weekday appointments. She declined and said she needed tests that did not belong to doctors with windows in waiting rooms. The voice provided a parking lot and a time and a person who would not exist in records as a person. She considered then that perhaps she had become sentimental. If she survived this, she might send the voice a fruit basket. She deleted the thought. Sentiment maps so poorly. Mara stood in the kitchen with the sun flattening against the window and let herself feel nothing for exactly 30 seconds. No anger, no pride, no fear, just the arithmetic. The arithmetic said Holden had been first. The arithmetic said being first mattered much less than finishing. The arithmetic said she had time. It did not guarantee that she had time. It said that if she had time, she should spend it on verbs that respect time. She opened the blue notebook and wrote a new name at the top of the page. Husband. She put a line through the word because labels are for containers, not men. She wrote his name and underlined it once. Under the line, she wrote a sentence devoid of adjectives. "He is better at this than I hoped, not as good at this as I feared." She closed the notebook and felt the room settle around a center it had not acknowledged since she first moved in. Predators prefer clean endings. So do stewards. She would give this ending the sheen she demanded of all the others, with the added complication that she would be alive at the end of it. Being alive places such pressure on narrative. People expect gratitude where strategy belongs. The kettle imagined warmth in its cardboard cave. The undersink waited for new tubes to bring it back into the family. The tulips collapsed into themselves like agreements. Mara drank water from the upstairs glass and tasted nothing except future. She began writing the antidote. The antidote began as a sentence, not a substance. Survival would need grammar first, then instruments. She listed audiences because audiences decide outcomes in homes more than chemicals do. A technician with clipboards who existed in invoices, a courier whose job was to notarize motion, a safe deposit manager who believed in stamps the way sailors believe in lighthouses, a neighbor who waved with her elbow and liked to narrate. She arranged them on days like pieces of furniture delivered, in a window between 8 and noon. Antidote as choreography. Antidote as paper trail. Antidote as witnesses that would not realize they had been hired until the third act. The parking lot appointment arrived on a weeknight that pretended to be a weekend. She parked under a lamp that hummed the color of receipts. A woman with a baseball cap and the gait of someone careful lifted a cooler into Mara's trunk and handed over a bag that called itself a wellness kit because commerce prefers optimism. The kit was a collection of vials and clean swabs and labels that loved barcodes. No instructions beyond arrows. The voice on the phone had insisted, screening only, classification only, no names, numbers on both sides, return with a timestamp. She signed nothing. The trunk closed on evidence like a book, shutting on a rumor. Back home, the kitchen wore evening-like formal wear. She harvested prints from the kettle handle and the undersink lever. She swabbed the inside of the gray mug and the travel cup's lid. She labeled in the small hand she saved for things that needed to be believed later by strangers. She bled 2 drops onto a card that turned them into geometry. She trimmed a lock of hair from the underside, a theft her mirror would forgive. She sealed each piece in its own small certainty and slid the certainties into the cooler under Heen. Ice blanket that sounded like applause when it settled. The return drop at the parking lot took less than a minute. Hands met, bag traded for receipt, a text following like a shadow. Results within 48 hours, classification only, no prescriptive advice, no requests for additional context. She drove home through streets whose lights knew her wheels. Holden texted a photo of a beer from a new place where all the chairs matched. She replied with a thumb that suggested participation. Waiting is a test disguised as elasticity. She stretched into it by cleaning parts of the house that never asked to be cleaned. She staged the office into the kind of order that later looks innocent in photographs. She placed the red notebook and the blue notebook into a fireproof bag, inside a box, inside a tote, that would travel to a building with guards who loved rules. She called the service line for the undersink system and booked a replacement she did not need, because new hardware comes with serial numbers that confess their birthdays. She scheduled an electrician to look at an outlet that worked fine because invoices acquit. The morning text arrived with the brevity of a verdict. Screening panel indicates cumulative exposure. Profile consistent with heat-stable inorganic signature. Pattern suggests intermittent microdose via common household water pathway. No name for the thing because names create recipes in the wrong hungry minds. Enough, though. Enough to move. She read the message twice and let her spine make an honest report. Shock did not show. Pride sharpened at the edges. Anger stayed in its suit. She placed the result alongside the taste and the fog and the basil that had sulked. Narrative aligned. arithmetic balanced. Survival gained footing. The technician arrived at 3 in a van without branding, the way competence sometimes travels. He swapped the filter as requested, recorded the serial, stuck a small sticker under the sink with the date like a flag. He asked about flow and taste, the polite catechism of his trade. She answered in sentences that would play well if anyone ever asked him later what he saw. He left behind a cardboard sleeve that had once held a cartridge and now held a future. Exhibit. She sealed it into a bag and wrote across the top the number the text had assigned to her day. Holden brought home flowers again, daisies this time, and optimism with stems. He poured her tea into the gray mug she had left precisely where he expected to find it. She thanked him the way favors expect to be thanked. She let the cup sit until it could not be accused of heat. She carried it upstairs and watered the basil she did not plan to keep alive. She rinsed the mug herself and returned it to the cabinet with its handle turned inward, the way it faced the day she found the spice label wrong. The house learned her message. She slept without the idea of sleep. Morning tapped at her temples. Anyway. Taste, fog, pulse, the usual chorus. She smiled at the choir, brushed with severity, ran stairs because oxygen has opinions. Holden left at the usual minute after performing the ritual of Key's phone wallet like a man reciting doctrine. She waved at his taillights and watched them turn a corner named for a tree that never grew there. The banker at the safe deposit desk admired her paperwork with a pleasure she recognized as professional self-esteem. 2 notebooks, the coolers, inventory manifest, a brief affidavit notarized in a kiosk at a shipping store where the employee had yelled at a roll of tape and then apologized to it. Mara slid the envelope into the box and let the lock take its small bite. Outside, she exhaled and felt the exhale measure the distance between hypothesis and proof. She needed one more piece. Behavior. Poison is a verb that leaves choreography. She reviewed weeks of Holden's limbs moving around this kitchen, the way his hand cupped the kettle like a faithful pet, the way he opened the undersink with the tender authority of a landlord. She replayed him offering coffee, a novelty episode. She rewound to the nights he chose tea, always turmeric, always the jar nearer the front, always the gray mug when he poured for her, a detail no guest would have noticed and no husband would have reason to repeat unless his hand knew more than his head admitted. She set a small stage. Nothing dramatic. Drama attracts auditors. On a Thursday, she suggested a movie neither of them would remember. On Friday, she adjusted the thermostat to a cooler number because sweaters make bodies linger over hot cups. On Saturday, she casually mentioned that she had been waking thirsty, an invitation to service which Holden revered the way some people worship explanation. He took the cue the way trained animals take a whistle. He reached for the kettle and the gray mug while smiling at his own domesticity. She reached, too, not to stop him, only to place the travel cup on the counter and say she liked it because it kept heat honest. He laughed and performed accommodation. Both cups, both lids, the same tea, the same honey she had moved into a new jar from the back. He added a slice of lemon to hers because generosity camouflages intent. He slid the gray mug toward her, the travel cup toward where she stood, then turned to fetch napkins because napkins are choreography's applause. She moved nothing. The cups remained where his hands told them to be. She lifted her travel cup and drank. She watched his hands later wash the gray mug with care that did not belong to plates. She slept and woke and counted the taste with precision. It arrived late, softer. A variable had been moved by someone, not by her. Enough again. The next week wore errands like armor. She replaced the kettle with a model whose box smiled about. Minerals. She bought bottled water in a brand she distrusted for everything except emergencies. She told Holden the old kettle whistled wrong, a sin his ears could believe. He accepted the upgrade with the happiness of a man who thinks change is his idea if he sees it after it happens. She scheduled a dinner with friends whose lives wore chaos. Group photos provide timestamps the future respects. The second set of results arrived with a simple note. Follow-up screening shows marked reduction after hardware swap. Residual trace may persist. Classification language remained loyal to itself. Enough. The narrative now had a before and after. Evidence needed a home that wasn't hers. She assembled a packet with copies and copies of the copies, a redundancy that could bore even insurance. She mailed it to herself, certified the old. Trick that turns a zipper into a seal. She sent another to an address the wellness voice provided for archival. She did not write the word poison anywhere the mail could read it. Envelopes retain gossip. Holden changed his pattern by a hair. He offered tea less frequently. He praised the new kettle's design. He mentioned a colleague whose wife had been feeling off and how doctors couldn't find anything. The way men test language in living rooms before saying it in conference rooms. He watched her mouth when she replied. She gave him an answer smooth enough to pass any inspection. Fatigue happens. Seasons change. Hydration solves most secular sorrows. She collected one more behavior. On a Tuesday, when she washed the travel cup and left it to dry upside down, he dried it and put it into the cabinet, a kindness he hadn't previously extended to plastic. The next night, when she reached for it, a film she did not recognize skimmed the lid's rim, the kind that belongs to nothing and to everything if you don't own microscopes. She cleaned it, slowly, while talking about traffic. He leaned in the doorway and nodded with his chin tucked, humility in rehearsal. She let him witness the wash. She asked him to taste the new honey. He did. She made a small sound that people use when contentment fits. Her body began to retreat from the fog, not like sunrise, more like an office turning on lights row by row. Memory sharpened until lists could again hold columns. The taste lingered some mornings like a superstition, then backed away. Basil revived enough to forgive. Sleep stopped pretending to be a performance and returned to being labor. She used that labor to make a final column. Outcomes. There was the outcome where institutions cleaned this house for her. There was the outcome where she did it herself. There was the hybrid she preferred, the kind that looks lawful in mirrors. She wrote names of professionals under each heading without contacting any of them yet, because the first call tells a story you cannot edit later. Holden announced a quarterly trip that would keep him 2 nights in a city that sold its skyline like jewelry. She kissed his cheek and admired his suitcase's competence. She walked him to the door with the rhythm of a partner in a commercial selling tires. After the taillights turned the corner, she opened the blue notebook and drew a square. Inside the square, she wrote, in block print, the word window. She filled the window with tasks. The garage camera received a new angle. The undersink area received a second sticker from a non-existent service call. The gray mug went into a donation bin 3 towns away. The travel cup acquired a twin she would store elsewhere. The new kettle received a hairline mark only she could see. She placed a small envelope under the mat addressed to no one, containing copies of nothing, because sometimes absence invites hands. She slept with the window open to see if the night would answer its phone. It did not. She woke with clarity. Anyway. 2 days later, the house greeted Holden with the same choreography it used on Good Husbands. He placed his suitcase in the hall as if expecting praise for returning. He smelled like a man who had traveled and believed the world owed him grace for it. He said he was glad to be back, a sentence healthy marriages deploy like vitamins. She poured him water in a glass whose mouth told her nothing and everything about the week. He drank with the comfort of a man home inside his own name. He offered tea, which now felt like a museum piece. She accepted and reached for the travel cup's twin. He reached for the drawer where lids lived. She watched the muscle in his jaw negotiate with his imagination. He poured in both vessels. He moved one closer to her with the confidence of days, the gray mug now impossible. The steam carried the scent of turmeric and lemon and a sweetness not quite honey. She lifted the cup and let heat speak for her. She drank a mouthful and nothing else. He watched without appearing to. She talked about a neighbor's new fence, the kind that pretends to be tasteful. He laughed softly. The house pretended not. 2. Her body reported in the morning, a faint echo of the old song, nearly kind. She filed it under attempt. The narrative had gained too much ballast to be capsized by a sip. Mara turned from surviving to stewardship again, but now with a different cargo. She walked the house with a camera that captured stillness rather than faces. The kettle's mark, the sticker's date, the line in the cabinet where a mug used to be, the sticker under the sink with the wrong service number that no one would notice until someone needed to notice. She photographed receipts next to their objects, then printed the photographs and wrote dates on the backs with a pen that loved to be permanent. She placed the stack in a folder that would eventually learn, the inside of a desk with drawers that locked in a building where people swore oaths. She did not call yet. Calling is a last resort in homes. First resorts belong to doors and paper and the arithmetic of patience. The neighbor who waves with her elbow stopped on the sidewalk and mentioned headaches. She had been getting them, she said, since her husband installed a new shower head that made every morning feel like a hotel. Mara smiled the smile people exchange when modern life writes footnotes into their bloodstream. She did not give advice. She listened. Information moves best when it believes itself to be loyalty. Holden slept well. He always slept well. Men who trust their furniture sleep well. His hand found her waist 2 nights running, a habit that belonged to both of them once and now belonged to no one. She allowed it. Touch is a narrative device. The wellness voice texted one last time. Archive complete. Custody chain confirmed. She read it and allowed herself the small luxury of relief that registers as posture rather than sound. She put down her phone and picked up the red notebook. She reviewed the sequence. She crossed out one verb and replaced it with another. Expose yielded to conclude. Conclusion could be a courtroom. Conclusion could be a kitchen. She had not yet decided which story the day deserved. She knew only that endings require rehearsal. She set a date on the calendar 3 weeks sketched into the future. A dinner at home with a recipe that had never once failed to look domestic in photographs. She invited 2 friends who would arrive early and talk loudly and leave late. She wanted witnesses to chairs and lamps, and her hands handling knives with the confidence of the innocent. She wanted Holden to perform his role so completely that he could not later argue he had played anyone else. The basil lived long enough to be replaced with flowers. The tulips had died. She chose eucalyptus because it stays disciplined even when it gets tired. The house smelled like the memory of competence. The filter under the sink hummed with newness. The kettle kept its hairline mark. The notebook slept where fire could not reach. The antidote had learned to stand. Mara looked at Holden over a weekend breakfast and assessed him as she would a balance sheet. Assets, posture, reputation, a faith in ritual. Liabilities, a belief that rooms obey. She took a bite of toast and decided she owed him something he had never given her. The truth. Not the kind spelled, the kind performed. She would let the house speak. She opened the blue notebook and wrote, without underlining, the sentence her hand had been avoiding. He started the story. I will finish it. As the evening bled into night, Veronica's mind spun like a storm trapped inside a fragile glass sphere. She stared at herself in the mirror, the reflection fractured by the weight of a truth too heavy to hold. He had poisoned her first. That fact pulsed like neon behind her eyes. Every moment of tenderness she had replayed in her head now felt staged, calculated, as if his love had been a smokescreen woven with poison and patience. She remembered the first time she felt sick. It was subtle. So subtle she blamed the wine, the long nights, even her own nerves. The bitterness on her tongue, the dull ache in her chest, the exhaustion that clung to her bones like wet clothes. He had watched her through it all, eyes soft, voice soothing, the picture of concern. But now, in the harsh glow of truth, she saw the glimmer behind his sympathy. Anticipation. Veronica paced the room, every shadow stretching like a threat. She thought of the bottle hidden in the garden shed, the one she had prepared for him, her escape from the web she had spun around his life. A single dose meant for one night, one quiet, irreversible ending. But now it felt like a punchline to a joke she had failed to understand. Did he know she knew? The question chewed at her sanity. At dinner, he had smiled like always, kissed her cheek, poured her wine. He had played the role so perfectly she wondered if he was waiting for her to collapse before dessert. Her phone buzzed on the table. A single text message lit up the screen. "How does it feel, darling, knowing you were never the hunter?" The room tilted. Her pulse thundered in her ears. That was not a confession. It was a promise. Veronica stood frozen in the center of the room, the words on the screen searing themselves into her mind like acid burning through paper. Never the hunter. It felt less like a message and more like a death sentence delivered with poetic cruelty. She stared at her trembling hands. The poison she had prepared for him, her perfect plan, her liberation from this suffocating marriage, was now meaningless. He had been ahead of her all along, weaving his own silent conspiracy beneath her nose, wearing affection like a second skin. Outside, the wind clawed at the windows, rattling them in their frames like the house itself sensed what was coming. She reached for her coat, her mind snapping between rage and terror like a pendulum swinging over fire. Confronting him felt inevitable, but part of her feared she was already too late, that maybe the poison in her veins was working even now, slow and patient like him. The front door creaked open behind her. "Veronica." His voice floated in, casual, warm, the way someone might call to a lover waiting for dinner. She turned slowly. He stood in the doorway, rain on his coat, a faint smile on his lips. He looked like the man she had married, the charming stranger, who had swept her off her feet. But now she could see the stranger more than the charm. "You knew," she whispered, the words tasting like iron. He stepped inside, closing the door with a soft click. "Of course I knew. Did you think I wouldn't? Notice the sudden sweetness in my evening tea? The way you watched me drink?" Her throat tightened. He had known for weeks, maybe longer. "You poisoned me first," she said, voice cracking. He laughed softly, not cruelly, but with the kind of amusement that came from winning a game only he had understood. "Marriage is a matter of timing, darling. You were planning your escape. I was planning, well, I suppose the same thing." She reached into her pocket. Her fingers closed around the small vial, the backup dose she had prepared in case something went wrong. His eyes dropped, to her hand, then back to her face. He didn't move closer, didn't raise his voice. He just watched her like a man reading the last page of a book he had already guessed the ending to. "You won't make it out," he said softly. "Not before it finishes what I started." Her heart pounded. Maybe he was lying. Maybe the poison wasn't working yet. Maybe there was still time. She uncorked the vial with shaking hands. His smile widened just slightly. "Go on. Try." She hesitated. Was this what he wanted? Was he daring her to take him down with her? Her vision blurred at the edges, dark shapes bleeding into the corners of the room. She lunged forward, slamming the vial into his chest, the liquid spilling across his shirt. He stumbled, surprised for the first time that night, eyes flashing with something almost like fear. "Drink it," she hissed, but her knees buckled. The floor rushed up to meet her like the closing curtain of a play. The last thing she saw was him standing over her, his face unreadable in the dim light. Maybe he would die with her. Maybe he wouldn't. Either way, the game was over.